Alrighty. So, last time we covered the 10 attitudes, or we covered 10 attitudes that lead to invalid reasoning. We covered 10 forms of invalid reasoning. And now we're going to move on to some miscellanea and go on to the theories of knowledge right quick. Alrighty, so first point I would like to make, as you can see on the slide, is that recall there are two types of syllogism: deductive and inductive. Okay? Deductive moves from what's more universal or more general or broader to what's more particular or more restricted. All right? So, an example: all men are rational. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is rational. That's an example of a universal affirmation, particular affirmation. The conclusion is a particular affirmation. That's a deduction, because particular is more restricted than universal. You start out with a more general statement, all men are rational, and you move towards a more particular statement, Socrates is a man. Inductive works the other way, goes the other direction. You might ask how that's possible. Well, in the empirical scientific method, that is utilized quite a bit. And what happens is you set up a condition, an if-then statement. If X, then Y. X, therefore Y. And, in a series of those, you see, for example, observations. You make observations of things are falling. This thing's falling, and that thing's falling, and that other thing's falling. Well, there must be some kind of force that's causing all these things to fall. And so everything must fall, as long as it's, within certain parameters or whatever. So that's moving from a particular experience to a generalization based on hypothesis, experimentation, verification, etc. All right. So in logic, we deal mostly with deduction, not induction. What else we got there? Many times also, induction will have to do with probable reasoning. So most of our reasoning has to do with probabilities and not with necessities. Okay. We will see some things that are necessarily true. In other words, conclusions of deductive reasoning in the course of this course. And we will not talk so much about probable reasoning until later on in the course. But if you notice, when people argue with each other, many times they just make assertions. An assertion is just you're just stating something without really having a strong argument to back your claim up. All right? Make sure you lock it when you come back. So, another term that you should know, non sequitur. Very common word, and we will talk about that in ethical contexts. Non sequitur literally means it does not follow, from the Latin. So, what is it talking about? What's it? The conclusion does not follow from the premises. So, an example. I don't know if this is exactly what Trump said or whatever, but this is an example of a rendition of something he said on the campaign trail. One study says that 80% of women crossing the border are raped. Mexico sends us lots of people. Therefore, many Mexican immigrants are rapists. It does not follow. What are some other possibilities? If 80% of the women crossing, let's grant the truth of the premises, 80% of the women crossing the border are raped, and there are lots of people coming from Mexico, what are the conclusions that you could draw from that? Other than many Mexican immigrants are rapists. Is there another possible explanation? Okay, yeah. Maybe the rapists are the Americans that are at the border. Maybe there's people at the border preying on these illegal immigrants. Right? So the fact that 80% of the people coming in, well, let's say 80% of the women crossing the border are raped, if that's a fact, doesn't mean that they're being raped by Mexicans. They're being raped by other people. All right. So that's just an example of a non sequitur that we commit all the time. We do that a lot. All right. Distinguishing between straw man and refuting the essential elements of an argument. So I talked a little bit about distinguishing slippery slope, the error of slippery slope versus the correct reasoning of reductio ad absurdum. So I'll mention that again, but the difference between straw man and refuting the most essential elements of an argument, that's also sometimes hard to see. So the difference. Straw man is simply, as we saw last time, taking an argument and distorting it into something else that's easy to refute. Okay. And I gave the example of Trump's executive order, that his actual position is that for national security, we want to come up with a vetting system so that we don't let terrorists infiltrate the refugee population, etc. Whereas if you want to reduce that to something easy to destroy, you can say, oh, Trump just doesn't like brown people or he doesn't want Muslims here. Okay. But that's not his argument. So you're creating an argument that's easy to destroy, and that's the straw man. Well, refuting the essential elements of an argument might seem like you're committing the straw man fallacy, but it's not. If you say so-and-so has this position, and they give a apparently complicated argument for it, but you can actually reduce their argument to these simple lines here, okay? And then you attack the fundamental positions in the argument. That's not the same thing as committing a straw man fallacy. So in other words, if you can show that the person's argument is actually reducible to these fundamental statements that you're reducing the argument to, then it's a valid argument. So the whole question is, are you validly simplifying the argument, or are you invalidly simplifying the argument? Are you leaving out essential parts of the argument? So you have to be able to discern what's essential to the argument and what's extraneous. Okay? And the same kind of thing, kind of distinction happens with slippery slope versus reductio ad absurdum. So again, slippery slope is associating one position with a consequence and associating that with another consequence until you get to something ridiculous, right? And then saying, okay, well, your position's ridiculous because of these consequences. Whereas in reality, the actual position doesn't lead to those consequences necessarily. You're just randomly associating consequences with the position. Okay. So we saw, for example, someone who is pro-gay marriage, argues for that, and somebody who argues against them says, well, if we legalize gay marriage, that might lead to the legalization of polygamy, and that's going to lead to the legalization of, bestiality. And do you really want that? Well, okay, that's not a good argument. Okay. Now, it might happen.
No.
That might happen in the future. Who knows? We don't know the future. It might not happen.
It
really can't happen.
So, well, you never know, right? There is a court case having to do with polygamy that will reach the Supreme Court at some point. Now, bestiality? No, in the U.S.
Oh, I thought you said you. I was like,
there is a court case. No. Reductio ad absurdum is slightly different. In that case, you would say, okay, so what's your position? Well, my position is that we should be able to love whomever we want and marry whomever we want, whomever we love, right? Okay. So then you say, what are the logical implications of that? You said marry whomever you love. Okay, so if you love a family member, should you be able to marry them? Well, no. Well, why not? So give an argument. Do you love multiple people at once? Why shouldn't you be able to marry multiple people at once? Well, okay, give an argument in response to that. But those are legitimate questions to ask. If somebody says, you should be able to marry whomever you love and love whomever you want, well, what are the implications of that? All right. So if you have no arguments, you say, well, it's just, you should just only be allowed to marry one person at a time. Well, that's not an argument. So then your position is a randomly held assertion. Okay? If you hold that you should be able to marry people of the same sex, but you shouldn't be allowed to marry multiple people or family members, well, you need arguments for that position. It's not just, you don't hold a random assertion for that. All right? So, moving on. So, we have the fundamental theories of knowledge that undergird or underlie the various theories of morality. Okay? So, we're going to talk about relativism resulting from several of these or some of these theories of knowledge versus objectivism is what I'll call it. Moral objectivism, which results from other theories of knowledge. Okay? So intellect comes before will. Usually before we do something, we have to think about what we're going to do. Right? We might think just a little bit, split second, or we might think a lot. Right? We'll talk about the virtue of prudence much later on. The role of the intellect in moral decision making. But because we only have free will because we have intellect, because we're able to think, okay, reflect on things. So, and we'll talk about that also in anthropological foundations. But for that reason, it's important to understand the theories of knowledge before being able to get to the theories of morality. The theories of morality are based on theories of knowledge. Okay, so we have idealism. What is that? It's not striving after an ideal. You take away the L, and you get more at the essence of the philosophy, which is that everything is reducible to thought or idea. In other words, there is nothing outside the mind. So this philosophy says there really is nothing outside the mind. It's just all construction of the mind. Our mind is projecting everything. Okay? We think we're perceiving an external reality, but we're really not. Okay? We're just perceiving our own mental constructs. Okay. So that's idealism. Everything is reducible to idea. There is no external reality. Subjectivism is similar, but it's the reduction of reality to the subject. Now, what's the subject? The subject is the I, the person, the conscious being. So, me, myself, and I, that's all that exists. So, subjectivism says the only thing that exists is myself. All I know that exists is my own self. I don't know if you exist. I don't know if anyone else exists. All I know is the I.
So this is reality to one person, you say?
Yeah. So, I know nothing about your inner experience. Okay? I know nothing. I don't even know that you exist. You might say you know you exist, but all you can know is that you exist and there's nothing outside of you that you know for sure. Okay. So the subject as a whole, not just the idea, so it's not just everything's a projection of the mind, but it's a subject as the whole. So you can say, well, I'm not only a mind, but I'm also feelings. I'm also, you might even say that I have a body of sorts. I have choices, okay, not just thoughts, but also choices and feelings, imagination, memory, etc. So that's all part of the subject, the I person. But I don't know of anything outside myself. Okay? Anti-intellectualism is a philosophy of knowledge that says that, all these questions about truth and whatnot, all these abstract questions, they really don't matter. We can't really know any of that stuff for sure. I'm just going to work on my car, and, I love working on cars, so that's all that matters to me. It's kind of like pragmatism. I'm just going to do my own thing. All these questions of truth and, what's really moral, whatever, no one really knows. That's just out there. That's, people can engage in mental masturbation, but I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to do my...
Wait, what?
You never heard that expression?
No.
Yeah, well, it's thinking just for the sake of thinking, like entertaining thoughts, and it's fun, to entertain thoughts.
Oh.
But anyway, so it's kind of dismissive of intellectual stuff. Okay, it's just like it sounds, anti-intellectualism. All right, so yeah,
What is idealism?
idealism is reducing everything to idea or concept, or mental construct. Right, everything else is just a projection of my mind. All right. Now, nominalism, and I'm going to group together with it conceptualism because they're similar enough for the purposes of this class. And nominalism comes from, like I said before, nomen, which means name. So we name things, right? So nominalism says, okay, there are things out in the world. We acknowledge things exist, but we can't really understand them as they are. We can only really name them. Okay, so we just kind of name randomly, okay, I'm going to assign the word desk to this thing, and I'm going to assign the word, assign the word podium to this thing, but I don't really understand what they are in themselves. Okay, I'm just naming stuff. All right. Conceptualism is similar. We have concepts, we have images in the mind of things outside the world, but we don't really get outside our heads. We don't really understand the things that are in the world. We just understand our own concepts. Okay. So it's similar to idealism and subjectivism, but it admits, okay, stuff is out there. We just don't really know it. Okay. We have a very superficial knowledge of things, let's say. It's not so important that you know the difference between mediate, exaggerated realism. I'll just say exaggerated realism, if you ever heard of Platonic philosophy, where it's debated whether Plato actually thought this, but some people would argue that there's ideas in the sky, as it were, in the heavens, that represent everything. So the idea of horse, when I think of a horse, there's a perfect horse that just represents all horses, and there's just a perfect essence of everything that we can think of, whatever it is, and the perfect essence of essences is the good, which is God, and in which all things participate. It's kind of abstract. You don't worry about it too much. But mediate realism says we can argue, we can kind of prove that the world exists outside of us based on the nature of our concepts, and we won't get into that. But what we're going to be adopting in this class is what's called critical or moderate realism, which says, okay, there is a world outside of us, and we can really understand the world outside of us. That's the common thing for all the realisms. So realism says we can understand things outside of us. But critical realism says, okay, our experience of the things outside of us is slightly different. So yes, we can have a common understanding of, what a desk is. We really know what the desk is. We really understand what the podium is. We really understand what human being is, we'll talk about. Okay, we can come to an understanding of that. But we also experience things slightly differently. Okay, and so there's not only an objective element, something outside the mind that we're striving to understand, but there's subjective element, meaning we, the subject, also play a role in understanding. So it's not just like we all know the same exact world in the exact same way, but the world is out there and it affects us each in slightly different ways. Okay, so it's good to ask questions. You know, like you might speculate on, okay, when I experience the color blue and someone else experiences the color blue, how do I know that we're actually seeing the same color, for example? Okay.
Was that immediate realism?
This is mediate or moderate or critical realism. Yeah. So you can,
What's mediate?
I'm sorry?
What's mediate again?
That mediate realism is arguing from the nature of concepts to the existence of the world. So the mediate realist says we can prove the existence of an external world. Whereas a critical realist has said, well, we kind of just have to accept the fact that the world exists, we're experiencing the world, and we can come up with probable arguments for the existence of the world. And you know, the world does exist, but you can't really prove it demonstrably through deductive syllogism.
That's critical.
Yeah. So, moving on, we will talk a little bit about subject and objective. Make sure you understand the difference between subjective and objective. Okay. Also, so I'll talk about that in a little bit. And absolutism is a term sometimes used. So I'm using objectivism to refer to moral objectivism, to refer to the idea that not only is there a world outside of us, but because there's a world outside of us, there are also certain moral truths that exist outside the mind, outside the subject, okay, in whatever fashion you want. And we have to work to discover what the moral truths are, okay, through reasoning. And, you know, based on our experience, etc. Now, the relativist says, no, we don't, there is no objective morality. So the relativist says, there, you know, whereas there might be some stuff outside the mind, so I might be a nominalist and say, okay, some stuff is outside the mind, but we can't really know it. Ergo, in the case of morality, we can't really know any objective moral norms, any objective moral truths. Okay? Or I might be an idealist or a subjectivist and say that, okay, because we can't really be sure that there is a world outside of us at all, well, we can't be sure of any objective moral truths either. And so the relativist says, because we can't really know anything objective, anything in the, at least in the realm of morality, that means, you know, I have my truth, you have your truth, you know, it's all relative. That's where it comes from. It's all relative. All right? There are no absolutes. Nothing applies to beyond me or beyond the subject, beyond this particular circumstance. And so the relativist will say anything can be justified based on the circumstances or the intentions of the persons involved. And we'll see that a little bit later in the course. So, in other words, relativism is a subjectivist or idealist or nominalist gnoseology applied to ethics. Okay, so applying that theory of knowledge to questions of ethics and morality. All right, now the word absolutism I don't really use because I think it's a misnomer, but relativists will call anyone who's not a relativist an absolutist. And so the relativists, the way they argue against moral objectivism is to say, well, you're kind of like the Islamic extremists, you know, who think that Sharia law should be imposed on everybody. So if you believe in objective moral norms, you know, you're just like trying to impose that on everybody. And no, I'm tolerant. I'm going to be tolerant, and I'm going to say, no, there are no objective norms, and we're just going to, you know, we each have our own opinion, and all opinions are equal. Okay. But you can see there, that's a false dichotomy. You don't have to either be a fundamentalist, right? Somebody who thinks, I know the truth and I'm going to impose it on everybody else. Or, on the other extreme, a relativist saying, we don't know anything about the truth. Everybody's opinion is equal. I could be somewhere in the middle. A moral objectivist, I would argue, is in the middle, saying there are objective truths, and we should all sincerely seek the truth, and we should all respect other people's attempts to seek the truth. And even if that person isn't seeking the truth, we have to respect the person, as having dignity to make their own decisions. But the fact that they make their own decisions not to seek the truth, or the fact that they might have opinions that are objectively incorrect, does not lower their dignity. It does not give me the right to impose my, let's say, correct position on them, right? Or to speak arrogantly, like to always say, well, I know the truth and you don't. Well, I might sincerely believe I know the truth, okay? Maybe I've spent many years investigating all the arguments on both sides, and I've come to the conclusion, a firm conviction on the position, right? And then I meet somebody who hasn't spent any years researching the issue, and they have a firm conviction, the opposite firm conviction. Well, I might think, yeah, I'm much more justified in my position, but that doesn't mean I'm going to treat the person any differently. I'm going to treat them like a person and talk to them and try to convince them of what I believe to be the truth. So trying to convince people of what you believe to be the truth is not wrong. People do it all the time. Okay? If you think that something is true, you should argue for it. But you should argue for it in a civil manner. Right? Arguing for what you believe to be the truth does not mean imposing a belief system on other people. Okay? But that's also different from what's very common today is, well, I don't want to impose anything on anyone, so I'm not going to argue about anything. I'm just going to sit back. I have my opinions. There's randomly held assertions. I won't call it that. But, I have my opinions that I just randomly chose without investigating the issue. And somebody else can have their randomly held assertions. And let's just all sing Kumbaya together. All right? Well, if truth is important, or especially moral truth, then maybe we should talk about it and try to figure out through reasoning what the truth is about things. All right, so this will become more concrete when we're talking about particular things in morality and ethics. But so, real quick, subjective and objective, again, to clarify that, subjective is how the person, the conscious subject, that is, experiences the world. So how I experience the world in my person, what happens inside me is subjective in the sense that it happens to me, the subject. Okay. Now, objective usually means what's outside the person. Okay. What's outside the mind, outside the subject, outside my feelings, in the world. All right. Now, there are slightly different understandings of subjective and objective depending on the context. Okay, and we'll see some of those eventually. But, like for example, even though my memory occurs within me, the subject, it's objectively true that I have a memory. My memory objectively exists in the world, right? Even though it's a part of the subject. So you can say the subject is a part of the world, the objective world. But my experiences, you can't really explain my experiences in terms of your experiences, and so they're slightly different. So there's that undefinable quality, if you will, that we call subjective. All right? So, again, the question of hypocrisy comes into play a lot in moral discussions. Example of that, maybe we can have a discussion now, and I'll end the lecture.